So thanks all for coming. I think this is a massively good turnout and maybe like reflects the interest and excitement in AI safety that's sort of in the EA community, but also sort of like in society more generally. So thanks so much for being here. I guess for people who don't know me, I guess there's some new faces. So I'm Greg Sadler. I think everyone who's been here regularly will have seen me talk a few times. I'm the CEO of Good Ancestors Policy and the Secretary of Effective Altruism Australia. At Good Ancestors Policy, we're trying to sort of have the Australian government take really seriously the ideas that are going to affect future generations and the ideas that are going to have really big impact, even if they're not the biggest electoral issues. And we'll talk a bit more about our theory of change as we go through the slides. So what are we doing today? By the end of this workshop, you're going to understand what the Australian government is talking about and what it's calling the Safe and Responsible AI consultation. You're going to be in a position to craft your own response to the discussion paper that government's put out about AI safety with the help of the guidance document that we've linked on that website. And you're going to be able to make a submission, or at least have a clear plan for action for making a submission by the closing date of 26 July. So this little picture before, you might have seen before, kind of has this idea of some things in this life are kind of low effort and high impact, which is really the gold, right? We're trying to find, because you could spend your entire life becoming an AI researcher, and that would be really great. But are you going to commit your entire life to that? I don't know. And there's all kinds of things which are lower impact, even when they're high effort, which just aren't worth doing. So we're trying to maximize that point between getting the most value that you can at the same time as sort of putting in the right amount of effort, but not like overcommitting or undercommitting to how much work goes into these things. So I mentioned I was going to talk a bit about the Good Ancestors approach, right? Like, how do we have a theory of change? And this diagram, it's a bit crude, but it kind of summarizes the way we see the world. So this idea of inside game, this is talking to senators, members of parliament, their staffers, public servants, directly about the ideas that are important. We think this is kind of like a necessary but not sufficient condition, because maybe the politician thinks like, yeah, these ideas are really great, but like, why should I care? Like, where's the votes in this? Where's the public sentiment in this? Like, mere evidence alone isn't enough to get something done, which is where the outside game comes in. We think it's important to send a signal from the country in general that actually we do care about the future, we do care about future generations, we care about these high impact ideas, and so government should act on them. And also, we don't want bullshit policy. We want rigorous and evidence-based policy that's like thoughtful and considered and based on research. And we think if we bring all of those three things together at the same place, at the same time, with aligned arguments, that we can get real political change. So here where this yellow box is, as in government's put out a question that they've wanted to hear the answers to, and we want to give them the answers that are aligned with what our values are. So does this theory of change work? So I think maybe only sort of a month ago we were here talking about the Productivity Commission inquiry into philanthropy. That had 3 streams of work in it. So one of those streams of work was coordinating this co-signed letter and media, where we got a whole bunch of organisations to write to the Commission and tell them about like what their ideas were to make charity in Australia more impactful. We ran community workshops like this around the country, and about 1 in 5 submissions that the Productivity Commission received were from people like us expressing our views, which is terrific. I think we were the loudest single voice in the entire country in that submission. And it wasn't sort of a super neglected submission. There were hundreds of people talking about all kinds of ideas, and we were important in that room. And then on the left-hand side, you see this sort of detailed submission that Effective Altruism Australia put in. So that was sort of like 30 pages of like really carefully researched, argumented things that sort of step through each of the ideas. So hopefully when those ideas like all land in the same spot, the Commission's got some reason to listen to those ideas. So I'm not going to step you through like every square on this flowchart, but essentially it's talking about how government is asking this question: how do we improve charity in Australia? And we're making these value-aligned submissions into that process. So there's a whole bunch of things people are saying in that context. They might be saying, like, we should make charity laws stricter, we should prevent rorts. But we're also putting into that conversation these value-aligned ideas of we should encourage impact, we should be measuring, we should be reporting, we should be thinking about animal welfare, we should be thinking about existential risk. And so that's flowing into government now at the process of designing, what it's going to say out of this regulation. And so because of that work we've done previously, myself and Mike Notel, the chairman of Effective Altruism Australia, were invited to closed-door meetings with the Productivity Commission, where we're going to talk about the ideas that we'd all helped raise behind closed doors. So that sort of powers the inside game because we had this sort of coordinated outside game effort, and that's helping us shape the way that is going to fall out. So that's the theory of change, and we think that we've got some wins on the board so far. So what's the opportunity today? So we're talking about the Safe and Responsible AI inquiry. The Australian government has published this discussion paper, and in it they say that we want your views on how the Australian government can mitigate any potential risks of AI and support safe and responsible AI practices. Good question to be asking, something I think we all think is sensible. It's informed by a March 23 report by Australia's chief scientist. So she wrote a sort of a 10-page document providing a 2, 5, and 10-year assessment of how she sees AI playing out. And then the discussion paper asks 20 questions. There's some sort of sub-questions there, so if you've looked at the website, like it's actually kind of a lot of questions that government's asking. And the goal of these submissions is to answer some of those 20 questions, and I'll talk through what I mean by some. So how does the Australian government see AI? Like, what have they expressed to us through the discussion paper and also the chief scientist report? So I think the main thing they think is AI is an economic engine, like it's going to make a whole bunch of money, and they don't want to see Australia be left behind. Like that's the singular thought, the main thought that's in their mind. I think that's reflective about Ed Husic, the industry minister, is leading it. It's being run out of the industry department, like they're seeing this as a money-making industry exercise. It is like a little bit conscious about wanting to mitigate individual and societal risks and to ensure that people trust AI. And it's kind of seeing that mainly through this lens where if no one trusts AI, like if we think it's going to be racist and it's going to be sexist and it's going to be biased, then we don't want to use AI tools. That would mean that we can't have the economic power that AI could present. So it's sort of a really narrow lens on why it's important to be ethical with AI. The other thing, which I think is a bit funny in the chief scientist report, is that government tasked her to think about AI on a 2 and 5 and 10-year horizon. And she basically said, I can think about AI on a 2-year horizon, but 5 years is pretty wild, and I definitely can't make forecasts about 10 years. And it seems that all of this stuff about existential risk and catastrophic risk, that's probably more than 5 years out, so don't worry about it. Which is kind of like a wild suggestion. And even CSIRO hasn't talked too much about this issue, but when they have looked at it, they've kind of said the same thing. Like this existential stuff seems a little way out, so we can just like ignore it for now, which is not like the best way for government to be thinking about things that are high stakes. So like to be fair to government, they are thinking about risks. Like risks are absolutely on the table and discussed in detail in the discussion paper. So they're worried about these sort of 2 classes of risks. So one of them is this idea of misuse. So they're worried about like fake images and videos and deepfakes, which is an important concern. So they've got that right. They're worried about misinformation and disinformation. I don't think they're fully worried about the way that could scale, like the complete destruction of society that you could achieve with just like bulk misinformation, disinformation, but it's on the radar. And then, persuading people of harmful and untrue things is on there. They've got a little bit about like model risks and deployment risks. So that idea of algorithmic bias is in their thinking. The fact that could cause inequality in society is on their radar. The sort of the racial and gendered issues that we've already seen in AI, things that they're worrying about. Data privacy questions. So those are all really fair things. I think that like on some dark corners of Twitter, there's like a sort of a war between like the AI safety crowd and the AI ethics crowd who think that they disagree with one another. Like I don't buy into that at all. Like I think that these ethics concerns are completely appropriate, they're completely right, they're justified in evidence, and like all power to people who are working to combat them. I want to yes and that conversation and not say that they're doing the wrong thing. I think we also should be concerned about longer run safety issues. And I don't think there's a tension between them. And indeed, I think when you think about like what short-term governance arrangements one should be building to address safety, it's often the same kind of things. Like if you take this issue seriously and you start building serious governance and regulation, you'll have spillover benefits. Like you'll build the machine that's necessary to tackle catastrophic risk by thinking about ethical risks. So I just don't buy into that tension, and I don't think it's something that we should be communicating or putting into the minds of government. Like I think it's unhelpful to everyone in the conversation. So I've said that there's no discussion of extreme catastrophic existential risks. So that's absolutely the case. The discussion paper, the one that we're responding to, doesn't mention it a single time in the entire discussion paper. It doesn't even get a footnote, and then it's like one sentence in the chief scientist's report. So it really is completely neglected and ignored currently by government. Absolutely. So I think that's like the main thing that we want to be communicating is like you can't ignore this idea government. Like it's out there. It's like the experts are calling for it. The media is talking about it. Like it's just bizarre that you government are trying to ignore this. So the discussion paper has these 20 questions with some sub questions. We're not going to. You can engage with all of this. Like I'm not going to recommend it. What we've done is we've selected a few of those key questions where it's like the most fertile ground for us to draw out the kinds of ideas that we're passionate about. So one of the issues is, does Australia even matter for AI risk? I think that this is, like, if you spend like too much time on the EA forums, like this might be an idea that you've got in your head. I think there's like a few different stories about why Australia should matter. So this flowchart's trying to talk this through a little bit. So nations are deciding what to do about AI. And if you follow that top track, they're thinking like, how are they going to shape international governance? Like what bodies is the UN going to create? What rules are they going to be governed by? And so there's a world where the international response to AI governance is weak, and then the companies can kind of do what they want. They can move to the countries that have sort of the lowest level of regulation, and I think that's a bad world. Or there's a world where countries like Australia are saying like, no, these international governance frameworks need to be really, really strong. They need to be globally coordinated. Like this is something that we need to put real muscle behind. And I think that's a world where we've got a better chance. Like I'm not saying it's like a panacea and all AI problems will be solved if only we did that, but I think it gives us a better chance. And then if you follow this sort of second track, which is about domestic laws and regulations. So Australia could be a country that puts in quite firm domestic laws and regulations about what happens if an AI goes wrong and hurts somebody? How does liability happen? Like what sort of licenses do we expect around AI models working in Australia? And so where domestic laws are weak, then it's kind of easy for AI labs to sort of say like, oh great, we can just deploy these things, like there's no licensing, no one's checking anything, we can just do the Wild West thing. But if Australia has like really strong laws, then that sort of flows through the power of capitalism upstream to those AI labs, right? Like if they know that to sell a product into Australia, it has to sort of meet certain requirements, pass certain audits, have certain transparency requirements, then those labs are more likely to bake those sorts of requirements in because no one wants to have to miss out on a large economy like Australia. I think we've seen that just recently with some electric cars out of China where they weren't meeting the Australian safety standards, so they re-engineered those cars to meet Australian safety standards, which meant everyone then benefits from that improved safety standard. So if all of those things happen, like there's a better chance that things are going to go well by sort of using the influence of Australia on a global stage. So what are we trying to achieve for this safe and responsible process? So this is the same kind of diagram that we were talking about for the charity law reform. So government's asking this question, they're asking for feedback on AI policy and regulation in Australia, and we have a chance to put in these submissions to the inquiry. So there's a bunch of narratives that are going to come out of this. So some people might be saying AI should be accelerated to maximize the economic benefit and the social impact of AI. Some people are going to be saying that AI should be responsible and ethical. We're hearing that from a lot of the university groups, like they're sort of feeding back to government this idea like, thank you for raising these ethical questions, we should tackle them. That's a narrative I support. But this idea that powerful AI has extreme risks and needs sort of strong regulation is sort of completely absent from the conversation currently. And I think that that's what we can inject into the conversation. So as we flow through that sort of idea of the flowchart, like past this consultation, government's going to take this and they're going to start thinking about like what policy and regulation do they need, and that's where we can start building on the work that we do in these sorts of forums to have that inside game. So I understand that the department who's running this is running some roundtables to talk about this with experts, so we're trying to use the work we're doing here to sort of get into those closed-door conversations, just like we did for the charity law reform. And then, like, as we chunk down this idea of implementation, right, like this isn't a one and done process. This is going to be a big conversation for a long time. So once we're in the conversation, like this sort of goes to your question, right? Like if we can get government saying like, yeah, AI safety is a thing, we need to start thinking about funding universities, we need to start thinking about building regulations, then that's going to be like more junctures for us to be involved in the conversation and shaping government in a good direction. So what should we be saying to government? We think there's like 4 really key arguments to make at this juncture. So the first one is Australia must acknowledge catastrophic existential risk from AI. So this idea of ignoring this problem is just a non-starter, and our sort of top talking point is like even the United Nations has pointed to these sorts of things, and the United Nations is like famously a sort of a slow and considered organisation, and if they can acknowledge that this thing is real, like, come on, Australian government, you can do this too. The second point is Australia must work with the global community and effective international governance. So, like, it sort of comes from acknowledging the risk, right? Like, if government says this is a thing that's worth worrying about, then when our lovely friends at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, like, they go off to negotiate international agreements, or even things like international standards groups, like where Australia has participants in all kinds of international standards negotiation. If all of those people have like, oh yeah, these existential risks are real, we need to think about those while we participate in these processes, then we can have influence there. The third point is that mitigating extreme risks from AI has to be part of a portfolio alongside existing near-term risks and harms. So the argument here is like, maybe we're all doomed, maybe this isn't really a problem at all and we're sort of panicking over nothing. It's hard to know for sure if your government, which one of those arguments is right. So this idea of a portfolio approach is like if you were having a share portfolio, like you would hedge against things going wrong. You would have like, maybe this is going to happen or maybe that's going to happen, so I'm going to have a bet each way. So what we're trying to say to government is we're not trying to persuade you that everything is necessarily going to go wrong with AI. We're just going to convince you that this is a real possibility and it's something worth thinking about and having some mitigations in place to try and prevent. And if it doesn't go wrong, like, well, that's fine. Happy days for you. And then the fourth thing is Australia must improve its technical capacity to identify, understand, and respond to AI risks. So this kind of really has two threads. So one of those threads is it'd be great to get more expertise into government. So the US is running this idea of Tech Congress, which is trying to get like experts into the congressional system, into sort of staffers of offices, like political offices, so that a politician who's got a question can ask it to someone who's sort of more up with the details, and also into the public service, so that, because like AI is going to affect like regulation across every sector, so making sure that there's experts in the public service who can give like reasonable and informed commentary about risks is important. And then there's this idea of university research. So currently there's like very little AI safety funding coming from government or direction from research grants coming into these fields. So we think that there's a way that government could just significantly increase funding into universities to respond to AI risks. So this is the 20 questions that I pointed out before, and these ones in yellow are the ones that we think it's most impactful to respond to, and the document will point at these in more detail. So this question on the left of screen is about gaps. So this is a chance to talk about the risks that we think are missing, and that policy and government action can be meaningful in addressing those concerns. These questions in this block are about there's ways to monitor AI and how it's being used and how it's being deployed, and to think about like what kinds of AI is unacceptably dangerous. There's sort of a flattening of the conversation, I think, when sort of people say AI, the ideas of like something that's sort of an algorithm on steroids to some godlike future machine can kind of just get smushed down into a single concept. So I think sometimes when people say AI is really dangerous, like what they're thinking is an algorithm with some fanciness on top is going to end the world. Like that sounds silly. And then that conversation can also break in the other direction when someone's thinking of like a godlike AI. Like how could you possibly think that a self-regulatory model is appropriate? So there's this sort of miscommunication. So having like clearer thinking about different kinds of AI and what the risks are associated with them is helpful. And then there's this chunk of risk-based approach questions down here, which has us thinking about the uses of AI, what's low risk and what's high risk, the indicators of what high risk systems look like, how like general purpose models might differ from more specific ones, and then like what specific policy and governance actions are needed to help. So I'm going to talk to like two different ways of participating in this. So the easy mode approach, which is the one that we recommend, is take this table that I'm going to show you. It's got star ratings next to questions. So there's questions that were highlighted in yellow. They have a 3-star rating next to them. And you can look at the metadata that's on that table and the answers and see an answer that sort of gels with what you think. You can copy that into the government website, have a read through it, change anything to make it more suit your views, and then you can lodge it quite quickly. I think it's completely practical to get that done in this workshop today if you want to take that easy mode approach. or at least maybe you've got half an hour of homework to sort it out when you get home. You can do a little bit more in that if you want, like you can put in increasing amounts of effort rewriting those questions, rewriting the proposed answers, or running them through GPT-4 and seeing if it can phrase something that's like closer to your language. And then we have this idea of hard mode, right? So you could read the discussion paper cover to cover, you could read the chief scientist's report, you could review many different answers that we've put forward to those questions and take and leave components of them. Or just like write your own response inspired by the content that we've got there and then put it in by 26th July. Or anything between those 2 points, right? Like you could take points from those columns. I think that the easy mode is the way to go. You will see when we get to the table that we've put in just like a colossal amount of effort to putting really good arguments here. So we can get started. What I'll do is, if you've got that website, you can open the pick and mix table and the government website. And I'll show you how it works. There's also a feedback form that's linked on the workshop page, and it's here as well. The feedback's super important to us in making these progressively better for you. Like a lot of the things that we've got into this website are from the feedback from the last process, so it's really critical to our work, so thanks for that. So how does this work? So if you go into the government website, you'll see this make a submission box. I think it's on the left-hand column with this purple make a submission button. When you press that, it will open up to what you're seeing in the middle there. One of the questions that might be a little bit tricky on first blush is this: should my submission be private or not? Our recommendation is if you make your submission public, that's better, because the public submissions will be viewable by a lot of people that's not just government, right? So I'm sure that researchers or members of the public or the media will say like, hey, I wonder what people are saying to government in this consultation process. And if there's lots of people saying, worry about existential risk in those responses, then that's helpful to like the broader narrative in society. But I understand that you might not want like your name publicly on something that you're submitting to a government process. Like that's a fair enough thing to do. So you've got the public and anonymous option, which will just drop off your name. So what you put in will still be there, but it won't have your name on it. And that's a fine thing to do as well. And if you're an extremely private person and you want to choose the private option, that's fine. Like, don't feel like you're not going to have any impact unless you attach your name to something and you put it in public. And another point on the government website that's like a little bit tricky is it asks, are you an individual or an organization? Like, you're probably an individual, which is fine. And then there's this drop-down box like, what sector are you in? Which seems to like not make sense if you've just said you're an individual. But one of the options in the drop-down box for the sector is an individual. So just say that you're an individual from the individual sector, and then you can progress through to the rest of the survey. So this is a snapshot of how the pick and mix table works. And I can tab over to it and play with it in the thing specifically for you. So essentially, we've got that table which has what the questions are and their star rating. No, this is us. Right. So this is our website with what we think. So this is question 1 that I've put up on the slide here. So the question is asking, do you agree with the definitions in the discussion paper? If not, what definitions do you prefer and why? So you can click the more information on this question if you want to see some like a short amount of discussion, like how we think that question should be read. Or you could look at the 4 answers that we've presented, 1.1 through to 1.4. So the bold text, like the definition should distinguish between current and future AI systems. So this is making that point that I made during the talk, that some people think about like an algorithm on steroids and some people think about what AI could be in 10 years from now. So this is saying, hey, government, like you need definitions that like properly distinguish between spectrums of capability, otherwise you can't have a good policy conversation. And then that metadata in blue, it's a short and clear answer. So when you click on that one, like it's like 2 paragraphs long, it's pretty clear. Whereas if you work down to different options, there's sort of like more technical options that you could choose from. So one of the answers in the more technical is saying that like governments pulled from these like NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology paper to get its definitions from, but those definitions themselves say that they're bad for certain things and they don't define certain things. So that definition has like a more, like that answer has like a more in-depth answer which says, government, you've used these definitions, like those definitions are bad to use for these particular reasons that's self-acknowledged, like here's a better way of having definitions. So it sort of unpacks it in more detail. Sure.
So with the last sort of submission process, how effective was this sort of like construction of like pre-configured answers in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's like highly effective. So it sort of goes back to that point on the first slide of like, what's the right ratio between effort and impact? So a lot of charities or sort of advocates who are doing this work will say like, here's a letter, like just photocopy it and sign it and send it in. And like I know from my experience in the public service that the way we react to that is we staple them all together and we call them like a campaign and we write one response to them and then we just have like an automatic system that sends out that reply to everyone. And that sort of has like no additional sort of value on top of it. Whereas what this pick and mix done, firstly, it breaks that logic because everyone's producing a truly unique response. And secondly, it gives us a way of putting just like a lot more information into the conversation than like one letter could do. So if you go through this and sort of choose your unique answers, like it's going to be potentially easy for you to produce a 2,000 or 3,000 word submission that makes like quite a lot of arguments to government that you just never be able to do in like a much more streamlined approach. And
That correlates with my experience in ministers' offices. Campaign letters where everybody just sends in the same postcard or the same letter, written in exactly the same way with different signatures on it. It's given us exactly as much value as email petitions, i.e. zero. So it's taken, whereas this sort of stuff actually does get noticed, particularly when there's a considerable. Every one letter that goes in like this, the rough calculation I make in the minister's office is probably 30 people out there in the community who are interested in one person prepared to write in individually.
yeah, I think that matches with my experience in the minister's office as well. I guess like we also like sort of have some demonstrative impact from this kind of approach in that both with the charities work and the previous work on existential risk, like we saw like a real change from how government was reacting based on these efforts. So I think all signs point to this as positive. Like, is it the best conceivable model? Like probably not. Like maybe it would be great for us all to take a week off work and do the hard mode approach, but it's just like not super realistic to do that. And I think like more is more in these conversations. So I think that this is sort of roughly the optimal point. So this is just talking through like how we're imagining you might use that question. So you've gone to, this is showing what the government website looks like. So it's like use this text box to put in an answer. And then you're choosing the response from those drop downs on the pick and mix table. And then you're personalizing the option and then you're going to the next question. So is that kind of clear? I could jump over to the website and show you if you'd like to actually see like what the website looks like. So this is the government website I was talking about. Oh, I've already gone one page in. Yeah, so this is the make a submission box in purple. I've decided I want to be public and I'm going to be Greg Sadler in this box here. I'm clicking next. So putting in some basic information about myself. Phone number is not required. I'm an individual. And that takes me to, so there's this page here about upload a submission. I think this is imagining you're uploading a document. So you can just ignore this upload a submission page and go straight through to the first question. You can drag this box bigger, so you don't have to like squeeze yourself into a tiny box. And then if you come over to the pick and mix table, so we're looking at question 1, which is here. And then I think I liked 1.3 or 1.2. I thought were good answers to this. Yeah, I liked 1.2 myself. So I'm going to say because this is the one making those sort of NIST arguments that I made. Some of them will have footnotes on them like this one does, where we're citing particular things. And you can just sort of move that into the government website and then have a read to make sure it sort of fits with your voice. And you can come back to these things fairly easily. So I just went through the next page, which has a few questions on it. But if I want to go back and hit back, it's still there. Like I've had this form successfully saving things for weeks. So it's like pretty decent at keeping information in it. So I might take questions. Otherwise, it'd be really great if like maybe we just sort of power through a question or two before I hand back over to Jenna and think about dinner and next steps in the meeting, and then we can cycle back. But I'm happy to take questions if people would like.
With the pick and mix, you're not worried about it being picked up as too generic?
I think I think that they will notice that there's been some kind of coordinated effort here. I think that that's like a good and a bad thing. So it gives you like a little bit of that flavor of, oh, there's a campaign going on here. But equally, it does send a signal that, hey, there's actually quite a lot of people who are quite invested and thinking quite thoughtfully about these ideas and producing like quite a range of opinions and approaches to it. So there is like a little bit of a risk, but I think like overall it's a good thing.
You can change the wording slightly.
Well, if you do want to change the word slightly, could you ironically put it in something like ChatGPT to reword it?
Yeah, so I mean, we did an online workshop last night, and people were doing exactly that, putting text into ChatGPT or GPT-4. I think it's worthwhile doing like a little bit of prompt engineering to sort of, like one of the prompts that was working well last night was to ask it to sort of use an Australian voice, an Australian language, and that seemed to like sharpen up its responses like much more than just sort of like asking it to rewrite things without any additional prompt. So I think it's a good thing to do. A little bit of personalization is really important. I guess it's just a matter of how much time you're happy to spend on it. Well, great. I might stop talking for a minute, and people can workshop.